This video will help the Passap dealer deal with selection errors and the many things that can cause selection errors. Okay, first of all, let's determine what a selection error is. Okay, when we pass the lock back and forth like this, as you see in this situation, the pushers are left in a 1-1 setting. That's one in work, one in rest, and so forth. When a pusher is pulled down into rest position when it should be in work position, this is considered over selection. Now in the reverse, when a pusher stays in work position when it should be in rest position, this is considered under selection. Now let's see if we can get a better idea of how selection occurs. Pushers that are in working position enter the lock at this point here, and they're funneled through the cams like this. Pushers in rest position enter the lock right here and are funneled through these channels this way. All of them come to this point, and depending on whether a small portion of this angular cam is activated as a magnet determines whether or not they are selected down and come out in rest position. Now if it's not activated, then they come out this way in work position. The same thing occurs coming back the other side. Pushers in working position enter, pushers in rest position enter. They are funneled through the cam like this. They move through the slot, and then if this small portion of this angular piece is activated as a magnet, it pulls the pusher down and it comes out in rest position, meaning selection has occurred. If not, it comes out in working position. Let's now turn on the computer box. It can say wait and then program, or it can say Wharton and program, meaning you're in the wrong language. If this is the case, we now need to get out of the wrong language by pressing R. Now it takes us back to the beginning of the languages. Do we want to speak German and French? Answer those no. Answer English with the enter key, meaning yes. It will now say program. Also, when we turn it on, it could say wait and then starting position. Press the enter key. It takes us back to program. Once we're back to program and we know that we're in the right language, press the enter key. It'll say erase. Then it says cast on. Enter in cast on 97. This is our test. This is our test for selection errors. Then press the arrow key and that will take us to cast on. Press enter and put it in starting position. Starting position is the last striking comb tooth at the end of the bed. Move the lock so that the arrow lines up with it. This striking comb tooth is just to the right of needle 89. Now answer starting position with the enter. Cast on, press enter. Put the front lock in SX. Press enter. Now put the back lock in GX. Make sure that the 0 key is pressed in. Now press enter. Now do one row empty. You may already have all the pushers and needles up in working position. If so, this is okay. Now pull the lock across. Whether or not your racking handle is up or down, answer this command, enter. If you haven't put all your pushers up and all your needles up, do so now. This is the front bed only. Now answer, enter. Now do one row empty. Answer the rest of the commands. Okay, put the front lock in LX. Now answer enter. Now, even though it says BX in the back, leave it in GX. Press enter. Now it says a row count of 0. Okay, we can now move the lock back and forth and check the pushers for selection errors. Our first sequence of selection will be 1, 1. That's one pusher in working position and one pusher in rest position. As we move the lock back and forth, it will be very easy to look for over selection or under selection errors. Okay, keep moving the lock back and forth. Now as we get to our 20th row, our sequence of pattern will now shift to a 2-2 pattern. That's 2 pushers in work and 2 pushers in rest position. Again, during this time we can now look for over selection or under selection errors. As we're doing this, try and look for a pattern. Look to see if the pushers that misselect, are they over selection, are they under selection, and what direction are you going when they misselect. Keep moving the lock back and forth. Now as we move to our 40th row, our pattern now goes into another sequence. It goes into various patterns of 1, 7. Now in this sequence, it's very easy to look for selection errors. Now try and determine, is there a pattern to your selection errors? Are all the errors over selection or are they under selection? Are they specific pushers? And which direction are you going when the selection error occurs? Now keep moving the lock back and forth. And as we get to the end of the third sequence, the first sequence will start over again and go back to 1-1 selection. And we can keep moving the lock back and forth through all these sequences to check and to test for selection errors. Okay, now what we're looking for again, here we have the 1-1 selection. Now here's an example of misselection being over selection. That means an extra pusher was pulled down into rest position. Now the opposite. This is under selection. One pusher stayed up in working position instead of being pulled down into rest position. Okay, let's look at some examples of what can cause misselection. First of all, is the lock being moved back and forth too fast? The correct speed the lock should be moved is about that at which the Electra 3000A would pull the locks back and forth. Okay, here's an example of misselection because of moving the lock too fast. Be fair with your test, because if you're moving the lock too fast, there's nothing we can do to eliminate selection problems. Okay, now we want to try oiling the pusher feet. Put a little oil on the brush and just very carefully wipe it across the feet of the pushers. You don't need a lot, just be sure that it's well covered. Okay, now with the orange ruler, push all the pushers up as far as they will go. Now with the brush, wipe across the bed and work the oil down into the needle channels. Once you've done this, now take a rag and wipe across the front surface to pick up the excess oil. Okay, now let's look at another thing that can cause problem with selection. These are old style pressing pieces. We want to make sure that the lock has new style pressing pieces in it. Okay, here's an example now of the new style pressing pieces. It's quite easy to change these out. First of all, what we need to do is get our Phillips screwdriver, and we want to remove this metal cam plate. Just take out these two screws right here. Now lift up on the metal cam plate and it should come off. Okay. Now we can remove the old style pressing piece on this side. There's a screw and a washer. Lift up and remove the pressing piece. Now you'll note on the new style pressing piece that there's a small rib or nub that will fit into a slot right here. So you no longer will need to adjust the pressing piece. Set it in place. Okay, now fasten it in place with the screw and the washer. Follow the same procedure on the other side. Now make note, there is a difference between the right side and the left side, and they have two different part numbers. Notice how it fits in place. And just fasten it down with the screw and the washer. Okay, now the metal cam plate, fit it in place. Now fasten it down with the two screws. All right, the next thing that we want to consider as far as a possibility, as far as having selection errors, is has the black guide runner on one side of the lock been pulled off or had the snaps broken on it so that it causes the lock to pull away from the bed? If so, we need to remove it and put on a new one. It's very simple. Just set it in place, press down, and snap it in, and then make sure that the snaps are fastened down securely. Okay, another thing that can cause selection errors is if one of the square holes in the lower main guide rail is blocked. Look very closely in the middle of the screen and you can see where it's blocked. Now watch me push it out. That can cause selection errors. It can also cause some other things like error 200. It can also cause the pattern to shift back and forth. Okay. Now another thing in considering selection errors is the adjustment of the auxiliary guiding piece. Pull the lock to the middle of the bed. Now loosen these two Phillips screws. Alright, now press the trigger upwards towards the handle. Hold it in place. Now tighten the two Phillips screws. Another thing to consider in looking for selection problems is the pushers. It may be that the feet are damaged, or it may be that that particular pusher is sensitive in that area. At any rate, you can also try replacing pushers if the problem is consistent to that spot. Now, another possibility is a problem with the needle channel. If the needle channel has become damaged somehow, you can look for a nick or an indentation. Okay, I'm going to push this pusher all the way up, and I'm just going to kind of move my tweezers back and forth inside this hole to see if there's any kind of indentation or a nick. However, this is quite rare that this could cause selection problems, although it is possible. Usually if there's a problem with the channel, it will be in the upper part where the needles move up and down, and that would relate to jamming rather than selection errors. The next thing that we want to consider as a possibility as a problem with selection is a problem with the E6000's second brake spring. Okay, we can remove it by pulling out this bar that's on the underside of the spring. Just disconnect it from the loop on the spring and pull it out. Okay, now pull the spring out. As we pull it out, take a look to see if there's any crimping in it or any stretched coils. This can cause a problem by making the pushers either move up and down too stiff or make them too loose. Okay, make your determination and either replace the spring or put the old one back in. And just push it back inside. Push it all the way in. Okay, now we don't quite want the looped end to go in yet. Okay, hold the looped end so it doesn't go inside while we press the bar back inside. Okay, the bar's underneath the spring. Okay, I'm going to get my tweezers here and hold the looped end of the spring so it doesn't disappear inside the end plate. Okay, I push the bar inside and I fasten the looped end to the little nub on the end of the bar and I press it all the way inside. Now that we've checked all these different items, we're now to a point where we can check to see if the problem is inside the front lock of the E6000. Okay, the first thing that we want to consider here is the positioning of our selector support. Now, we have a special gauge for this, and this is how the gauge fits into place. Alright, now what we want to do is to check the height of the base plate in relationship to the flat surface of the gauge. Alright, now here's a diagram of how the gauge fits onto the front lock. Okay, study it for a minute. Okay, we can only check one side at a time, as you see by the arrows shown as C, it's checking one side and then the other side. We don't need to check both at the same time. Now you can see it from another angle. What we want is for the base cam to be lifted up flush with the gauge, as shown in number 1. But we don't want it lifted so high that there's a space shown as number 2. Now, this base cam can be either raised or lowered by adjustments made on the screws shown as J and K. Okay, now here you can see one more time the fitting of the gauge as we showed you in the first diagram. Okay, now as shown in the second diagram, you can see the base cam on the left-hand side of the television screen here. Alright, now the base cam is on the right-hand side of the television screen, and this is what was shown as number 1. And we want to make sure that there's no space between the base cam and the bottom side of the gauge. Then right here would be what was shown as number 2. We don't want the base cam lift so high that it lifts the gauge up, and there's a space right there between that part of the gauge and the black rail. Okay, now the screws that we adjust that were shown as J and K are also now shown in figure 11 here as C and D on one side and A and B on the other side. And what we want to do is alternate those, turning those two screws so that the base cam becomes flat up against the gauge. What we don't want, though, is for one screw to be turned so much without turning the other one that one screw is not flush up against the ground plate. Now, so you can see the adjustment screws that are shown in figure 11, we're going to take the front cover off of the front lock. Okay, we need to remove the row counter knobs right here. Now we want to remove the NX lever. Now the handle, remove this screw here. Okay, now this screw on this side. And lift the handle off. Okay, we're now ready to take off the white casing. Okay, on one side, press the little catches off the edge of the ground plate. Now on the other side. Okay, you can see it done from another angle here. Now carefully lift off the white hood. Okay, now you can take a look at the screws that we have just shown you as the adjustment screws. You see C and D. C is right there, and D is right there, Here's A. And here's B. Okay, we want to go ahead and adjust these screws, so as I explained before, so that the base cam on the other side is flat up against the gauge. Once we've adjusted all this, if it was necessary, we can test the lock using the test 97 we showed earlier. If there's still a problem, it is possible to fine-tune the selector support, but it's important we start at the point where the selector support base cam is adjusted to the gauge. Okay, now so we can do further testing without reassembling the lock, we want to remove the white cable from the casing right here. Okay, go ahead and put the lock in GX. Okay, now I'm going to put the handle on, but I'm going to put it on upside down. Okay, now the reason I'm doing this is so that we will have access to all the adjustment screws. If I put it on the correct way, we'd find that one of the adjustment screws, its opening would be blocked. Okay, now put the lock onto the machine bed and go through all the commands of that test 97 that we showed you earlier. Okay, get it set up so that we can check for selection errors. Now move the lock back and forth. Now as we move it, we're going to again watch for selection errors. And again, we're going to try and determine, is there a pattern to selection errors? Are they over selection or are they under selection? And in which direction are we going when the misselection occurs? Now here you can see we have several cases of under selection. And here is another case of under selection. You see, this pusher here should have been pulled down into rest position. But because it wasn't, it's under selection. Now, if the under selection occurred going from left to right, the adjustment screw that we want to adjust is C. Now, we must leave screw D alone. Okay, we're going to turn screw C 1/4 of a turn counterclockwise. This is going to move the upper part of the selector support closer to the bed. Now check again for selection errors after you've turned this screw. Now after we knit several rows, if we discover that we still have under selection errors, what we can do is adjust this screw again up to another 1/4 of a turn for a total of 1/2 of a turn. Now, had our selection errors occurred going right to left, then the screw that we would adjust would be A. And again, we would leave the B screw alone. Okay, now here's the A screw. Turn it a 1/4 of a turn counterclockwise and test for selection errors. If we should still have a problem with under selection right to left, we can turn the A screw another 1/4 of a turn for a total of no more than 1/2 a turn. If we turn it more than that, the A screw would just pull away from the support, leaving all the pressure on the B screw. Let's now look at some examples of over-selection. Over-selection is when the pusher should have stayed in work, but it was pulled down into rest. This is an example of over-selection. Do you see any over-selection in this pattern right here? Okay, it's this pusher right here. It should have been up in working position like this. How about any over-selection here? Okay, this pusher right here should have stayed in work position, but it was pulled down into rest position instead. Okay, fine-tuning the selector support when over-selection is involved, we would adjust the same screw that we did before, but instead of turning it counterclockwise, we would start by turning it a quarter of a turn clockwise. Then again, test for selection errors. Now, if you should still have over-selection going from left to right, we would adjust that screw 1/4 of a turn more clockwise. What we are trying to do is move the base cam of the selector support away from the bed so that there would not be as much tendency for over-selection to occur. As before, it's very important that we not turn the screw more than a total of 1/2 a turn. In the case of turning it clockwise, what would happen is the D screw would pull away from the support, leaving all the pressure on screw C. This is also why it's important to start our fine-tuning adjustment when the base cams of the selector support are adjusted exactly to the gauge we showed earlier. Now, in the case of over-selection right to left, screw A is what we would start to adjust, and we'd start adjusting it 1/4 of a turn clockwise. Then test again for selection errors. If we still have a problem with over-selection, adjust screw A one more time 1/4 of a turn. And again, it should not be adjusted more than 1/2 of a turn. Now remember, during the whole fine-tuning process, screws D and B are left alone. Now, it may be some of you are having a difficult time understanding how turning these screws is affecting our selector support. The selector support is the part of our lock that has all the electromagnets on it that causes the selection of the pushers. The selector support is spring-loaded to the ground plate of our lock. The adjustment screws we have been talking about, A and C, as well as B and D, determine its position. The tension springs between the ground plate and the selector support make sure there is constant pressure and also allows us the ability to fine-tune. If after fine-tuning the selector support we still find that we have selection errors, it may be necessary to replace the selector support in the front lock. Okay, from this point, go ahead and put the lock in the KX setting. Alright, now move the white cable out of the way by taking it out of the handle support. We now want to go ahead and remove our handle support. We have 4 screws here that we want to remove. Okay, we have one right here. Go ahead and unscrew it all the way. And another one right here. And remove this one here. and unscrew this one right here. Okay, now for our handle support to lift off, again, it's very important that we be in the KX setting. Okay, lift the handle support up, lift it off of the cam slider. Now pull the white cable down through the opening. Now be careful we don't lose the 4 screws when we set this down. Now go ahead and remove the cam slider, lift up, work it off, and pull it out. Now remove the pusher cams. Just make note of the direction they go in so that we'll know when we put them back. Okay, let's remove this Phillips head screw right here. This pulls the circuit board on the selector support up against the ground plate of the lock. Now remove this screw right here. This has a ground wire on it. Okay, now you remember these screws. These are our screws A and B right here. Let's go ahead and just start loosening those. Now right here, these are screws C and D from our illustration before. Let's just go ahead and start removing those. Okay, once these are loose, we can now remove what's called the cam body. Okay, we got 3 screws that hold the cam body in place. Okay, go ahead and remove these 3 screws right here. Now you'll find that the 3 screws that fasten down the cam body are a different size than the ones that are shown as A and B and C and D. Okay, now remove the screws on the cam body on the other side. And the third one right here. Okay, because we loosened our adjustment screws A, B, C, and D, it now leaves enough room that we can remove the cam bodies once the 3 mounting screws are removed. Okay, just kind of lift up, just wiggle a little bit, and it comes out. Now on the other side. Okay, this now just leaves the selector support fastened in place. Okay, let's go ahead and finish taking out our adjustment screws. Okay, go ahead and take them all out. All right, let's just compare the size of the adjustment screw compared to the one on the cam body. You see, the adjustment screw is longer. Okay, let's remove this adjustment screw right here as well. Now on the other side. Okay, now at this point, if we want to, we can go ahead and remove this metal cam plate. Okay, we can wait till later on this if we want. We don't have to do it right now, but it will need to be put on the new selector support. Okay, loosen and remove these two screws here. And lift up, and it comes off. Now, let's not forget to remove our light barrier brush. Let me get it in a good position here, and we'll take it out. Okay, here you can see it much better. Okay, just reach around the sides, and now just use a little gentle persuasion and just kind of work it out. It'll come out. Okay, we're now to the point where we can take the selector support all the way out of the lock and remove it from the ground plate. Okay, work the circuit board out at an angle from underneath the black rails, and work the white cable out as well. Okay, notice this little white ring right here has fallen off. Okay, when we reassemble it on the new one, it will need to be fitted right here. Okay, before we put the new selector support in, what we'll need to do is to mount some parts off the old one onto the new one. Okay, we got the 4 tension springs that we talked about earlier right here that need to be fitted onto the new one. Just pull them straight off and mount them on their positioning pins. Okay, push down and they kind of snap into place. Now we have 2 metal positioning pins right here. Be sure that these are taken off the old and fitted into the new one. Now these are very important because these positioning pins will fit up through the ground plate of the lock and will determine the position of the selector support when it's finally fitted into place. Okay, now the little white ring. Now you may want to put a little Vaseline on the inside of the circle. That will hold it into place. Okay, fit it down. Okay, we're now ready to put the new selector support into the ground plate. Okay, run the white cable through the opening. Okay, now bring the selector support up. Now fit the selector support circuit board, the print, underneath the black guide rails. Kind of go in from an angle and then it will fit into place. Okay, work it down into position, wiggle it a little bit, and it will fit down just fine. Now, the first thing that we want to do is to fasten down our ground wire right here, just to make sure that it doesn't get pinched between the circuit board and the print when we start fastening down all the screws. Okay, set it into place and fasten it down with the same screw that it was held in place with before. Okay, now be careful that the wire isn't so far down that it gets caught on the handle support when we mount that later. Okay, now if we push the selector support up, you can see how the metal positioning pins now press up through the ground plate. Okay, that way we know it's in position as we start to put in our mounting and adjusting screws. Okay, now remember, we used the long screws here that we removed. Don't get these screws mixed up with the ones that we took out of the cam body. Okay, you remember these, A and B? Okay, now the ones on the other side. You remember these? C and D? Okay, just get these started. We can't fasten these down yet or make our adjustment yet because we still need to have enough room for our cam bodies to fit into place. Okay, now fit the cam body into place. Now on the other side. Okay, let's go ahead and put in the 3 screws that hold the cam body into place. Okay, you'll probably only want to start fastening these down. You probably won't want to tighten them all the way down yet. We can come back and do that a little bit later. Now on the other side. Okay, again we have 3 fastening screws for the cam body. Let's go ahead and get them started. Alright, now that the cam bodies are put into position, let's go back to our 4 adjustment screws and just fasten them down a little bit farther now. Now let's put into position this Phillips screw right here. As we fasten it into place, this will pull the print board up and out of the way. Okay, fasten it good and secure. Okay, now go back to the 4 adjustment screws. And what we want to do at this point is to start tightening them down. And we don't want to worry about our adjustment yet. For now, we want to tighten them down as far as they will go. Now, the reason we're doing this is so that when we start to adjust, we'll be starting from a fixed point. And this way, we'll know where we're at all the time. Okay, now that we've done this, let's go back to the cam bodies and make sure that all 3 screws on each cam body is fastened into place. Okay, now do this side. Okay, let's go ahead and start moving our adjustment screws. What I'm going to do is go to all 4 screws and turn the screwdriver 1/4 turn counterclockwise, and this will start to let the selector support move down. Then go back and do it another 1/4 of a turn on all 4 screws. This way we know that the selector support has moved down evenly on every side and on each screw. Okay, now do it one more time. This is the 3rd time. 1/4 of a turn. Okay, we've now turned the screw 3/4 of a turn total on all 4 screws. Okay, now take a look here. Again, here's our diagram showing how the gauge will fit onto the lock in relationship to the selector support. And what we want is for there to be no space where it is shown as number 1. And see, J and K are the screws that we'll be adjusting. Okay, J and K, in another diagram, that's A and B, and then it's also C and D on the other side of the lock. Let's go ahead and fit the gauge to the lock now. Okay, just like in the diagram. Okay, now these are the screws that were shown as J and K. Go from one to the other just a little bit, and as you do this, look at the gauge on the other side and watch and see how the base cam moves up flat up against the gauge. Just alternate between the 2 screws until the base cam right here, this is what's shown as number 1, lifts up against the gauge. Now also, we don't want it to lift so high that there's space right at this point right here. That's what's shown as number 2 on the diagram. Okay, once we've done that side, we need to put the gauge on the other side of the lock and do the same thing on the other side. Okay, alternate between those 2 screws, and as we do, look right here, there's the gauge and there's the base cam. Okay, as we turn the 2 screws, the base cam will lift flat up against that gauge. Here you see the diagram again. And one thing we want to be very careful of is notice the screws J and K. We want to be careful that we turn them together so at no time does the head of the screw lift away from the ground plate and all that pressure is on the other one. Okay, let's go ahead and remove the gauge once we've completed the adjustment on both sides. Alright, let's go ahead and fit this cam plate back into place. Okay, fasten it down with the 2 screws. Go ahead and fasten these down good and snug. Now let's go ahead and fit the light barrier brush into place. It might look like it won't fit, but the catches are towards the very back. Okay, if you're very careful, just push it in and it'll snap into place. Okay, now let's go ahead and fit our pusher cams into place. Remember the position they were at when we took them out. The little nub will face downwards. Okay, let's fit our cam slider into place. Fit the pusher cams up into the cam slider. Okay, let's now take our handle support and fit it into place. Okay, let's run the white cable through the opening. Okay, and start positioning it over the top of the cam slider press down. Now, for this, it's very important that it be in KX. Okay, let's fasten it into place with the 4 screws. Okay, now the third one goes right here. If you'll use a little bit of Vaseline on the end of the screwdriver, it will hold the screw in place while you get it started. Now the fourth one. Let's now go through and tighten down all 4 screws. Fit the white cable down into the black handle support. You'll need to press very hard to make this fit. Now fit the cable into the white cover of the lock. Now, as you do this, be sure that you leave just enough slack so that when we fit the cover to the ground plate, that it will fit securely and it won't be blocked. Okay, put the NX lever in the middle. Now fit the cover to the ground plate and the front lock. Okay, fit it into place. Now pull out the catches on the side of the casing until they fit around the edge of the ground plate. Do it on both sides. Now fasten your handle into place. We have 2 screws here. Go back and forth, but be sure that this is fastened down securely. Let's now put the lock in the GX setting just to be safe. Now fit the NX lever handle. Okay, we're now ready to fit the knobs for our row counter. As you put these into place, make note that they're keyed. Be sure that they're properly aligned before you fit them into place. Also, the clear lever as well. Now finish fitting the white cable. This concludes the assembly of our front lock. Once we've installed our new selector support in the front lock, we should now put it on the machine and go back and run it through the test 97. It may be necessary that once a new selector support is installed, that selector support will also need to be fine-tuned to that particular machine bed. This concludes our video.